The topic of the present video is force degradation. Is there any limit for it? So many of us know that force degradation is performed to understand the degradation mechanism, the conditions due to which the API get degraded, and also the conditions in which the formulation may get degraded. Mainly force degradation study is performed for the API or drug substance, and also to understand the impurity generation, it is also performed onto the formulations. So whenever we are talking about the force degradation, we say that we are inducing the degradation of API to certain extent to study the sensitivity of the API and also to study the intrinsic stability. So during force degradation, the samples are exposed to the acidic condition, basic condition, humidity, light, peroxide, and other conditions as per the requirements. And the drug substance undergoes degradation, and the mass balance is done, the impurities are studied, and the potency is studied. And the results are compared with the initial or control sample. For example, acid treated sample and base treated sample, then humidity exposed sample, thermal exposed samples. All these samples are analyzed and the impurity generation is studied and compared with the initial one. That is also called as the control sample. So in force degradation, we study the initial assay and initial impurities, and we study the impurity generation after forced degradation and the potency or percent assay after forced degradation. So the question here is there any limit for the forced degradation? There is no specific limit given into the guidelines that what is the limit for forced degradation, how much degradation is required, or how much degradation is enough. Regulatory requirement for the percent degradation. Many of the scientists perform the forced degradation for some of the days and they get around 5 to 20% of the degradation. Then they stop the forced degradation activity and they get the conclusions. Forced degradation study is mainly done to study the method sensitivity, method analytical method development, and also the forced degradation study is performed to understand the impurity formation pathways and correlation with the real-time drug degradation. Many of the time, the forced degradation data is correlated with the formulation sensitivity and with the API sensitivity. And based on that, the stabilization ways are studied. So 5 to 20% degradation is enough, or 10% degradation is enough, or is it the aim of the force degradation study that you should get at least 10% or 5% or 20%? If I go on the force degradation, I will end up with the complete degradation. Or for some of the APIs, the degradation will be there will be a variation. Sometimes it will be 10%, in other condition it will be 15%. So is there any specific limit for the force degradation, and whether it is a regulatory requirement, or when we should stop the force degradation study, or when we can say that if the method is capable to detect 5%, 10% or 20% of the degradant, then the method is sensitive. So the video is for answering these questions only. See, assay limit for some of the markets like US, it is 90 to 110% of the label claim. For some of the markets, the assay limit is 95% to 105% of the label claim. So there is a variation of around 5% to 10%. And what it will be if you consider if it is degradant impurities or whether it is a moisture gain, whatever you consider it, you should correlate these things with the assay limit. So generally 10% degradation is considered as enough. Many of the professionals consider 5 to 20% degradation as enough to stop the degradation studies. One guideline is there from the ANVISA that says 10% degradation or more per condition is enough or can be enough. The lower or higher degradation should be justified based on the scientific studies, and these are required to be provided. So one of the guideline is there from ANVISA which says regarding the 10%, but I have not found other guidelines or regulatory specification limit for force degradation like 5% or 15% or 20%. So from this information we can understand that around 10% degradation can be enough, and if you are getting around 10% of the degradation, then you can justify the force degradation studies. So this was the aim for the present video. I have prepared a separate video on force degradation study which gives you the complete understanding about force degradation studies, what are the stress conditions, how these force degradation studies are performed, why these are performed, what are the applications. So in description I will mention the link. You should watch that video also so that you will get more information. I hope I have covered the present limits for force degradation, and in your upcoming force degradation studies you can consider around 10% of the degradation as a standard. If you are getting more or lower degradation, that is also can be justified, but for the present you can consider the 10% degradation as a justifiable limit for force degradation. Thank you for watching the video. Please do like, share and subscribe to Pharma Learning in Depth channel. Thank you.